The gift of sex. We are to view sex as a sacred gift from God, to be used within the bonds of marriage. Here's Gene.
Now, at this point in the letter, you have another very subtle thing here that, if you get this, it really helps you understand the next few paragraphs. Because he actually begins this chapter with this, about the things you wrote. Now, in order to understand this, let me just review for you what has happened. Obviously, Paul received a letter from the Corinthians. And so he's responding to things that they wrote to him. He had written a letter to them, however, before they wrote back to him. And that letter is not in the New Testament. And that's referred to, we've already seen it, but in chapter 5, verse 9. I wrote to you in a letter not to associate with sexually immoral people. We don't have that letter. It's been lost. And then what happened was they wrote a letter back to Paul. That letter was probably delivered by these three men that are mentioned in chapter 16. Let me take you back to chapter 16. Brothers, you know the household of Stephanas. They're the first fruits of Achaia, have devoted themselves to serving the saints. Probably lived in Corinth, but he says Achaia, so they may have lived in Cenchrea, which was a town about 7 miles from Corinth, or they may have lived in another area, but at least they were very, very significant men, a significant man, a family in the church, or at least influenced by the church. And so he came along with these other two men that we mentioned earlier and probably gave an oral report, and that's where Paul got the information about the divisions in the church. And you remember he said at the beginning of the letter, I've heard about all these divisions. And that's probably where they got that information. But at the same time they gave an oral report, they said, Paul, here's a letter from the Corinthians because they've got some questions about your letter and your teaching. Now let me finish this and then we'll come to that. I urge you also to submit to such people and to everyone who works and labors with them. I'm delighted over the presence of Stephanas, Fortunato, and Achaicus, because these men have made up for your absence, for they have refreshed my spirit and yours. So they're the ones then that delivered the letter, and so Paul is responding to that letter, and so he says, about the things you wrote. So let's go back then to that paragraph. About the things you wrote. And he uses another slogan. This is a quotation that they throw at him in this letter, and they say, it is good for a man not to have relations with a woman. Now, to translate that in a sense or to understand that, the slogan says it's good for a man never to have a sexual relationship with a woman. So basically, to understand this, you have to realize that their lives were so perverted that when Paul came along with a new morality, or a morality that's God's morality, they overreacted and said, Paul says sex is wrong, so let's not have any sex. I mean, that's how they overreacted. And that's the slogan. And Paul says, that's not totally true. Let me modify this. In other words, there were a group there in Corinth that were promoting being celibate, and Paul goes on to answer that and says, Now he qualifies it, but he says this, but because of sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife. This is what God created. Each woman should have her own husband. A husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, likewise a wife to her husband. That was another distortion. So here they were married, and they got distortion, and that is that it's good now that I'm a Christian, I shouldn't have sex with you anymore. Now you say, how in the world could they get so distorted? Well, think of what they came out of. Think of the pollution of their minds, and then they get this new idea And so they distort it completely. A wife does not have authority over her own body. Her husband does. Equally, a husband does not have authority over his own body, but his wife does. In other words, there was fighting within the marital relationship. Paul says this. Paula says this. Peter says this, and they came up, this slogan is this: it's good for a man never to touch a woman. And so you can see the distortions that had crept in. So when he says, about the things you wrote about, he's answering that. He addresses the slogan, and he says, that's not a true slogan. That needs modification, clarification. Do not deprive one another, except when you agree for a time to devote yourselves to prayer, the only reason. Then come together again, otherwise Satan may tempt you because of your lack of self-control. And you can imagine the temptations in that culture with the prostitutes walking down the streets, 1,000 of them. I mean, the temptation was everywhere. Plus, these guys had lived that lifestyle. You talk about sexual addictions. Paul's dealing with some real tough stuff here. And he says, I say this as a concession, and here now he's going to give them his opinion. I say this as a concession, not as a command. I wish that all people were like me, in the sense that I have the gift of singleness. But the majority of people don't have that. God never created that. From the Garden of Eden, he never created that. But each has his own gift from God. I recognize that, Paul says. One this and another that. And then he goes on to explain another issue that he talked about, they wrote to him about. I say to the unmarried, to the widows, it's good for them if they remain as I am. That's fine. But if they do not have self-control, they should marry. For it is better to marry than to burn with desire, to be tempted, to live within the situation when the possibility is there and God has created this gift of sex. So you see, Paul is dealing with the bigger picture here and the distortions that they were writing to him about. And so that basically gives us a perspective on this principle. As Christians, we're to view sex as a sacred gift from God to be used within the bonds of marriage. And Paul made that very, very clear. Now, the question is, how does Paul's instructions about marriage relationships in his letter to the Ephesians add a spiritual dimension that is far greater than the mutual responsibilities outlined in 1 Corinthians 7, 1-8? In other words, what Paul is simply saying in 1 Corinthians, just zeroing in on the issue there in Corinth, is saying basically, if you're married, you have a responsibility to each other. God has created it that way. Don't deprive each other. Don't use it as a weapon, but consequently love each other and meet each other's needs. And he kind of leaves it at a physiological level and a psychological level. But when you read Ephesians, he adds a whole different dimension. And that is, we love each other as Christ loved us. That takes the physiological aspects and the psychological aspects of that, puts it in the context of God's love for us. And we are to love as Christ loved. So it's not just a duty, it's a privilege. And it's an opportunity to demonstrate Christ's love. That's why it's important for us to put these passages together so that we get a total perspective on what Paul is teaching about certain subjects, in this case, the gift of sex.